A knife flashed in the noon sun. A hand yanked a woman's head back by her hair. She screamed, boots scraping the dirt as she fought to stand. The blade sawed once, twice, and a thick braid dropped into the mud. Men on the boardwalk froze. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. The man with the knife laughed and held the severed braid high for the whole street to see. Her name was Nella Fry, and her only crime was a bowl of stew. Across the street, an old drifter set down his tin cup. He didn't shout. He didn't rise in a hurry. He just whistled, low and soft, and a scarred bay mare lifted her head. What did that ragged stranger do next that brought a whole town to its knees? Believe me, it's worth every second. Stay with me on this one. Now let me back up. Let me show you the town, because you need to understand how a man like Roy Deacon came to think he owned it. Dusty Fork was a small place. One long street, a row of storefronts, a church with a leaning steeple, and enough dust to bury a boot every summer. It sat off the main trail in the Arizona territory, far enough from any real authority that the men who lived there had learned to keep their heads down and their opinions quiet. When trouble came, it came from the same direction every time. It came wearing a tin star. Roy Deacon was young for a sheriff. 26, maybe 27. He had the kind of good looks that made people trust him at first and the kind of temper that taught them not to. He wore his gun low and his hat back, and he walked down the middle of Main Street like the whole street had been laid out just for his boots. When he passed, folks stepped aside. When he spoke, they answered quick. He liked that. He liked it more than anything. Deacon had a rule about beggars. He said it loud and he said it often. No charity in Dusty Fork. No handouts, no free rides, no coddling the men who drifted in broke and hungry off the trail. You feed a stray dog, he'd say, and pretty soon you've got a pack. He said it was about keeping order. Everybody knew it was really about power. A hungry man is a scared man, and a scared man does what he's told. Deacon understood that in his bones. Now here's the thing about Nella Fry. She wasn't a fighter. She was a waitress at Molly's Cafe, a small woman with a quick smile and a long dark braid she'd worn since she was a girl. She worked 12 hours a day slinging coffee and stew to teamsters and cowhands, and she saved her tips in a coffee can under the counter. She wasn't rich. She wasn't important. She was just kind, and in Dusty Fork, kindness was starting to look like a crime. That morning, an old man had come into town on foot, leading a bay mare that limped on one leg. He was tall but stooped, silver-haired, with a beard gone white and clothes worn near to rags. He looked like 100 other broken drifters who passed through and moved on. He tied the mare loose outside the mercantile, sat down on the boardwalk in a patch of shade, and set an old tin cup in front of him. He didn't beg. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, quiet, like a man who had all the time in the world and nowhere he needed to be. Nella watched him from the cafe window for the better part of an hour. She watched folks step around him. She watched a boy toss a pebble at him and run off laughing. And she watched the old man take it all without so much as a flinch. Something about that steadiness got to her. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't angry. He just waited. At noon, she filled a bowl with stew, wrapped a heel of bread beside it, and carried it out across the street. Her boss, Molly, called after her from the kitchen. "Nella, don't. You know the rule." But Nella kept walking. She knelt down in front of the old man and set the bowl in his hands. "Eat," she said. "It's on me." The old man looked up at her. His eyes were a pale, faded blue, and they were sharp. Sharper than any beggar's eyes had a right to be. For just a second, Nella felt like she was the one being studied, not him. Then he nodded, slow, and said something so quiet she almost missed it. "Kindness costs the giver," he said. "Remembers the one who gets it, though, longer than you'd think." She didn't know what to make of that. She smiled, told him to keep the bread, and started back for the cafe. And that was when a shadow fell across the boardwalk. Boot heels, slow ones. She knew the sound before she turned. Roy Deacon had been watching too. He came off the street with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt and a smile that had nothing friendly in it. "Well now," he said. "What's this?" He looked at the bowl in the old man's hands. He looked at Nella. And the whole street seemed to go still because everybody who'd ever seen Deacon smile like that knew what came after. "Just feeding a hungry man, Sheriff," Nella said. Her voice stayed level, but her hands had started to shake. "It's my own food, my own money." "That's so." Deacon crouched down and knocked the bowl clean out of the old man's grip. Stew splashed across the boards. The tin cup went rolling. The old man didn't move to catch any of it. He just watched it fall, calm as still water, and set his empty hands back on his knees. "I got a rule in this town," Deacon said, standing back up. He said it to the old man, but he was looking at Nella. "And you just broke it in front of everybody. Now I could fine you. I could throw you in a cell, but money and a night in jail, folks forget those." He shook his head slow. "No, I want this to be something they remember. That's the part I want you to understand before we go on. Because what Deacon did next, he didn't do in anger. He did it cold. He did it slow. And he did it because he wanted every man, woman, and child in Dusty Fork to see exactly what happened to people who crossed him. The stakes weren't a fine. They weren't a bruise. The stakes were the whole town learning, once and for all, that being kind would cost you dearly. And an old man sat in the dirt and watched it all with those pale, patient eyes, saying nothing. Deacon's hand went to his belt, and the sun caught the long blade of his Bowie knife. He grabbed Nella by the wrist first. She twisted, tried to pull away, but he was strong and he was fast, and he dragged her off the boardwalk and out into the middle of Main Street where the light was hard and there was nowhere to hide. Folks came to their doors. Nobody came off the porch. That was Dusty Fork for you. They'd watch a thing happen. They just wouldn't stop it. "You want to hand out free food," Deacon said, loud enough to carry. "Then you can pay the price out here where everybody sees it." He wrenched her head back by the braid. Nella cried out. She grabbed at his hand, dug her nails into his wrist, kicked at his shins, and none of it mattered. He held her still like she weighed nothing at all. And then he cut. The knife was sharp, but a braid is thick, and it took him 2 strokes, sawing at it, while Nella screamed and the town watched. Then it gave, all at once, and Deacon staggered back a step with 1.5 feet of dark hair in his fist. Nella dropped to her knees in the dirt with her hands over the raw, ragged ends of what was left. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was just crying, quiet, the kind of crying that comes from someplace deeper than pain. Deacon held the braid up over his head and turned a slow circle so the whole street could see it. "Let this be a lesson," he called out. "Charities for churches, not for my town." A couple of his men laughed. Nobody else did. And Deacon, grinning, tossed the braid down into the mud at Nella's knees like it was garbage. That's when the old man moved. Not fast. That's the thing that stuck with everyone who was there. He didn't leap up. He didn't shout. He just reached down, picked his tin cup up out of the dirt where it had rolled, and set it careful on the boardwalk. Then he put 2 fingers to his lips and whistled. Low, soft. A sound you'd barely notice if the street hadn't gone so quiet. Down at the hitching rail, the scarred bay mare lifted her head. And she came. Limp and all, she walked right to him and stood at his shoulder and waited, the way a good horse waits on a man she trusts with her life. Deacon glanced over at the old drifter and his lame horse and laughed. "You got a problem, Grandpa." The old man didn't answer. He just looked at him. And for one strange second the sheriff's grin flickered because there was something in that look that didn't fit. Something that didn't belong on a beggar's face. But the moment passed. Deacon sheathed his knife, spat in the dirt, and walked off down the street like a man well pleased with his morning's work. And here's where you'd think it ends. Here's where the story looks like it's over, because it did settle down. It really did. Deacon disappeared into his office at the far end of Main Street. His men drifted after him. The doors along the boardwalk closed. One by one, folks going back to their business the way folks do, telling themselves it wasn't their concern. Molly came running out from the cafe at last and knelt down beside Nella and helped her up, murmuring, dabbing at her face with her apron. The old man got up too. He was slow about it, but not as slow as he'd been before. He picked the braid up out of the mud, brushed it off gentle as you please, and coiled it careful into a loop. Then he walked over and pressed it into Nella's hands. "Keep this," he said quiet. "Don't throw it out. There's things a man ought to be made to look at." Nella took it. She didn't understand, but she took it. Molly led her back inside, sat her down, brought her a cup of coffee she didn't drink. And the old drifter and his lame mare stood alone in the empty street, and the sun climbed higher and Dusty Fork settled back into its ordinary quiet. The dust drifted. A dog barked somewhere and gave up. It was over. Everybody breathed easier. It was done. It wasn't done. It hadn't even started. Boot heels on the boardwalk again. Roy Deacon was coming back. He'd had time to think, see, and thinking had made him meaner. It wasn't enough to shame the waitress. He'd noticed that old drifter whistle his horse to heel, noticed the way he'd looked at him, and it had gotten under his skin. A beggar who wouldn't beg. A beggar who wouldn't cringe. In Deacon's town, that couldn't stand. He came straight down the street with 2 deputies behind him and stopped in front of the old man. And this time, he wasn't smiling at all. "You're a vagrant," Deacon said. "No money, no property, no reason to be here. That's a crime in Dusty Fork. I'm taking you in." He put his boot down flat on the tin cup and crushed it into the boards. "And I'm taking that sorry excuse for a horse to pay your fine." Now, up to this second, understand, the whole thing had been personal. One cruel man teaching a lesson. But the moment Deacon reached for that horse, everything changed. Because it stopped being about a braid and started being about the law itself. It stopped being about one waitress and started being about who, in the whole Arizona territory, actually had the right to say what was just. Deacon just didn't know it yet. He had no idea what he'd walked up to. The old man stood up straight, all the way up. And it was like watching a different man come out of the same clothes. The stoop was gone. The shoulders were wide. He looked Roy Deacon dead in the eye, and when he spoke his voice had dropped all its softness. "Take your boot off that cup, son," he said, "and take your hand off my horse." Deacon barked a laugh, but it came out thin. "Or what, old man?" The drifter reached up and pulled the rags of his coat open at the collar. Underneath, hanging on a leather cord against his chest, was a piece of iron the whole territory would have known on sight. A 5-pointed star, worn smooth with years, stamped with 2 words. "Deputy Marshal." "Name's Cassius Vane," the old man said. "United States Marshal Service, riding the Southern Trail these 11 years. And I've been sitting on your boardwalk since sunup, Sheriff, watching how you run your town." You could have heard a pin drop in the sand. One of the deputies took a step back before he even knew he'd done it. Cassius Vane. If you rode the trails in those years, you knew the name the way you knew thunder. He was the lawman they told stories about around campfires. The one who'd walked into the Sabar gang's hideout alone and walked out with all 4 of them roped behind him. The one who'd never lost a prisoner and never shot a man who hadn't drawn first. They called him fair and out there. Fair was rarer and more feared than cruel. Because a cruel man you could bribe or run from. A fair man came for exactly what you'd earned, and he did not stop coming. And now here's a fine thing to sit with for a moment before we see how it all lands. If you've ever watched a bully get exactly what's coming to him and felt that little lift in your chest, then do me one small favor. Hit that subscribe button and stick around. Because I promise you, the way this ends is better than you're imagining. All right. Back to Main Street, where Roy Deacon has just gone very, very pale. Deacon tried to cover it. Bullies always do. "Marshal or not," he blustered, You got no jurisdiction over a town sheriff. This here's my. I've got jurisdiction over federal crimes anywhere in this territory, Cassius said. And you've been busy. He reached into his ragged coat and drew out a folded paper, soft and creased from being carried a long way. You want to know why an old beggar was sitting outside your mercantile all morning, Deacon? I'll tell you. I've been trailing complaints out of Dusty Fork for 6 months. Freight wagons that come through and get charged a road tax that don't exist in any law book. Homesteaders paying you protection so their barns don't burn. 2 men jailed on charges you invented, whose families paid you to let them out. He tapped the paper. That's federal mail fraud, extortion, and false imprisonment just for a start. I came to see it for myself before I put irons on you. And this morning, you were kind enough to show me exactly the sort of man you are. In broad daylight, in front of your whole town. Deacon's hand drifted toward his gun. It was a small movement. Cassius saw it the way you'd see the sun come up. Don't, Cassius said, just the one word, and Deacon's hand stopped. But a cornered man is a dangerous man, and Roy Deacon had spent his whole life never being cornered. Boys, he said to his deputies low and fast, he's one old man, take him. Nobody moved. That was the moment the whole thing turned. His own deputies stood frozen on the boardwalk, looking from their sheriff to the legend in rags, and they did not move. Because every one of them had heard the name Cassius Vane, and not one of them wanted to be the man who drew on him. Boys, Deacon shouted, and that's when he made his mistake. He went for his gun himself. I want to tell you it was a fair fight. It wasn't. It was never going to be. Deacon was young and quick, and his hand was already halfway to the leather. But Cassius Vane had been drawing a pistol against men trying to kill him since before Roy Deacon was born, and old hands don't forget. There was no fumbling. There was hardly a sound. 1 second Deacon's revolver was clearing his holster. The next, a shot cracked flat across Main Street, and the gun spun out of Deacon's hand and skittered into the dirt, and Deacon was clutching his fingers and howling. Cassius hadn't even seemed to hurry. His own pistol had simply appeared from somewhere inside those rags, already smoking. I could have put that through your heart, Cassius said, calm as ever. I don't shoot a man who's got a chance to do better. Question is whether you deserve the chance. Get on your knees. Deacon stood there cradling his hand, shaking, his eyes darting around at a town that had come back out onto its porches, at deputies who wouldn't meet his gaze, at doors opening all up and down the street. And in every one of those faces, he saw the same thing. He saw that his power was gone. It had drained out of him the second that star came out from under the rags, and it was never coming back. On your knees, Cassius said again, in the street where everybody can see. You seem to set a lot of store by that this morning. And Roy Deacon got down on his knees in the dust of the street he'd owned, slow, his head down, his shoulders shaking. The very picture he'd tried to make of Nella Fry an hour before, only now it was his own, and there wasn't a soul in Dusty Fork feeling sorry for him. Cassius walked over and pulled Deacon's fine Bowie knife from its sheath, the same knife that had cut off a woman's hair. He turned toward the cafe. Miss Fry, he called, come out here if you're willing. Nella came to the door with Molly behind her. Her eyes were red, and her hand was pressed to the raw ends of her hair, and she was scared. But she came. She walked out into the street and stopped a few feet from the kneeling sheriff and the old marshal, and she waited. This morning, Cassius said to her, this man took something from you to teach the town a lesson, so let's teach a better one. He held out the Bowie knife to her, handle first. You've got a right to answer him however you see fit. Cut his hair if you want it, or worse. No man here will lift a finger to stop you, and no court in the territory will say a word. He's yours. Now the whole street held its breath. And here's the thing about Nella Fry, the thing Deacon never understood, the thing that made her different from him and better than him in every way that counts. She looked at that knife. She looked at the man on his knees, at his shaking shoulders and his broken hand, and she shook her head. "I don't want his hair," she said. Her voice was hoarse, but it carried. "Cutting mine didn't make me smaller. It just showed everybody what he was. Cutting his won't make me bigger." She looked at Deacon then, straight at him, and there was something in her steadiness that was worse for him than any blade. "You wanted them all to remember me on my knees. They won't. They'll remember you on yours, and that's answer enough." Then she turned and walked back to the cafe, and she didn't look back once. Cassius Vane watched her go, and something moved across that weathered old face. It might have been the closest thing to a smile he had. "There it is," he said, quiet, mostly to himself. "That's what you were too small to see, Deacon. She was the biggest person on this street the whole time." He slid the Bowie knife into his own belt. "This I'm keeping, as evidence, and because a man like you doesn't deserve a good knife." He pulled a pair of iron cuffs from inside his coat and snapped them around Deacon's wrists, careful even with the hurt hand. Then he hauled him up onto his feet and turned him to face the town he'd bullied for so long. "Roy Deacon," Cassius said, loud and formal now, so every ear could catch it. "You're under arrest under the authority of the United States Marshal Service for extortion, fraud, and false imprisonment. You'll answer for all of it before a territorial judge in Prescott. Your badge is forfeit as of this minute." He reached up and unpinned the tin star from Deacon's vest, and he dropped it in the dirt, and he did not look at it again. He turned to the two deputies, still frozen on the boardwalk. "You two, you've got a choice to make right now. You can ride to Prescott behind this man in irons of your own, or you can pick that star up out of the dust and start being the kind of law this town's never had. Won't be a third offer." The younger of the two, a lanky kid named Prout who couldn't have been 20, swallowed hard and stepped down off the boardwalk. He picked up the star. He wiped it clean on his sleeve. "I'd like to try, sir," he said, "the right way." "Then that's a start," Cassius said. He walked Deacon down Main Street to his own jail and locked him in his own cell, and if there was any justice sweeter than that in the whole territory that year, I never heard of it. The whole town followed at a distance, quiet, watching, hardly believing what they'd seen. The man who'd owned Dusty Fork was sitting behind his own bars, cradling a busted hand, and an old drifter in rags had put him there without hardly raising his voice. Cassius stayed 3 days. He wasn't a man to do a thing halfway. He took down statements from every soul Deacon had squeezed, the freight men, the homesteaders, the families of the two he'd jailed on lies. He wrote it all out in a careful hand, page after page, and folks who'd been too scared to speak for years found their voices, one after another, once they saw that the fear was really gone. Turned out the road tax money was buried in a strongbox under the floor of Deacon's office. Cassius dug it up and paid it back, coin by coin, to the people it had been stolen from. He gave the last of it to Molly to cover a month of free meals for anybody who came through hungry. "New rule for Dusty Fork," he told her. "You feed a stray, you get thanked, not fined. Print it up and nail it to the wall if you have to." On the third morning, he got the bay mare ready to ride. Juniper, her name was. He'd found her half-starved and hobbling on the trail 2 years back, left to die by men who had no use for a lame horse, and he'd nursed her sound enough to carry him, and the two of them had been together ever since. Folks understood, watching him check her feet and murmur to her, that this was a man who'd never in his life walked past something that needed help. That was the whole of him. That was why he'd sat on a boardwalk in rags. He'd wanted to see who in Dusty Fork would still be kind when kindness cost them something, and he'd found her. Nella came out to see him off. She'd cut what was left of her hair short and even, and honestly, it suited her. She looked steadier than she had in years, like a weight she'd carried a long time had finally been set down. "You could have said who you were the second he grabbed me," she said. "It wasn't an accusation. She just wanted to understand. Why'd you wait?" Cassius tightened the cinch and thought about it. "Because a man's true face only shows when he thinks nobody with any power is watching," he said. "If I'd flashed this star at sunup, Deacon would have smiled and bowed and hid what he was, and I'd have had nothing to hang him with. I needed him to show the town himself. I'm sorry it cost you your hair, Miss Fry. I truly am. I didn't know he'd go that far that fast." He paused. "But you answered him better than any law ever could. You gave the town the one thing I couldn't. You showed them what standing tall really looks like. It isn't a gun. It's what you did with that knife in your hand and chose not to do." Nella pulled something from her apron pocket then. The braid, cleaned and coiled, tied with a bit of ribbon. She held it out to him. "You told me to keep it," she said. "You said there's things a man ought to be made to look at. Well, Deacon's the one who ought to look at it, not me. Take it with you to Prescott. Put it in front of that judge. Let it say what I can't." Cassius took the braid and turned it over in his old scarred hands, and this time the smile did come, all the way. "Now that," he said, "is the finest piece of evidence I've carried in 11 years. He tucked it careful into his saddlebag. Then he swung up onto Juniper, easy despite his years, and touched his hat brim to her, and to Molly, and to young Prout standing straighter than he ever had with a clean star on his chest. He turned the mare down Main Street, toward Prescott, toward a judge and a jail and whatever came next. At the edge of town he stopped, just for a second. He looked back at the little street with its leaning steeple and its dust, at the cafe door where Nella stood watching, at the town that had learned in 3 days what it should have known all along. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He put 2 fingers to his lips and whistled low and soft, the same as he had that first morning, and Juniper flicked her ears and picked up her pace, limp and all, carrying the most feared and fairest lawman in the territory off down the trail. And Dusty Fork was never the same after that. In a good way, I mean. Folks started nodding to strangers again. Molly's cafe kept a pot of stew warm for anybody who came in broke, and nobody ever fined her for it. Roy Deacon went to Prescott in irons and stood before the judge. And they say the thing that judge stared at longest, the thing that seemed to trouble him most, wasn't the ledgers or the strongbox or the sworn statements. It was a coiled dark braid, laid on the table by a United States Marshal, that told the whole story of what one small, cruel man had done, and what one kind woman had refused to become. They say Deacon got a long stretch of years to think about it, and they say Nella Fry, last anyone heard, was still working at that cafe, still ladling out stew to hungry men who couldn't pay, her hair grown back long, wearing it loose now instead of braided. Somebody asked her once why she didn't braid it anymore. She just smiled and said she liked to keep it where everybody could see it, free, the same as she'd always been.